Journalism postures and pretends to represent the first draft of history, but really it's more like a first draft of a first draft of a first draft. It's incredibly immediate and in the now, and so on. But even living in that sort of immediate, in the now realm, if you just sort of leap from headline to headline around the world today, if you don't understand religion, you don't understand what's happening in the world right now. And I could list many different examples. I think Peter's point about Christianity's growth in China, for instance, is an incredibly interesting, somewhat understudied, in part because China is still somewhat opaque to us, phenomenon that as China goes through a period of potentially of political upheaval or not upheaval, depending on what happens with the ongoing reforms or not reforms and so on, the religious changes sort of are part of the substructure, basically, of whatever is going to happen in China over the next 40 or 50 years. And I think Western observers may end up very surprised by the role that religion ends up playing in that country. So that's sort of a long-term example, but just to stick to the short term, you know, we basically have a world order in the West that is being disrupted right now across multiple fronts by conflicts and trends and patterns that are all intimately connected to religion. And you can sort of draw a kind of triangle with one point in Moscow and another point in Germany and another point somewhere in the Middle East. It'll be a slightly misshapen triangle, I guess, not misshapen, but not an equilateral triangle. And move from point to point, just looking at everything from, you know, obviously the phenomenon of ISIS, the Islamic State at the heart of the Middle East, to the sort of connected to that, this ongoing sectarian conflicts in Syria that in turn are spilling over into Western Europe with mass migration patterns, the likes of which we haven't seen in a long time, that are inevitably connected and leading to divisions that are rooted deeply in the differences between Christian and Islamic civilization, and that even in allegedly secular Europe, those differences are felt, I think, very powerfully, and are sort of felt very powerfully in, I mean, it's interesting, you can sort of you can see what's happening in Europe and sort of the political tension between the European leadership class and the actual European public as kind of an example of how Peter's secular intelligentsia, his secular leadership class, doesn't necessarily understand the world that it's trying to govern, and doesn't understand that world in ways that may be destructive to its ability to govern it. And you know, the reality of sort of the secular leadership in Europe right now and its inability to handle mass migration is that it is empowering political parties and political movements in Europe, some of which are on the far left and are sort of notionally secular in that sense, but many of which are on the far right and see themselves as sort of reviving Europe's Christian character. So you have that kind of tangle. I'm not sort of coming to a fine point here. I'm just trying to sort of sketch out the tangle. And then connected to that tangle, you have the sudden attempted reemergence of Mr. Putin's Russia, which is, of course, a form of muscle flexing and power politics and so on that is, in that sense, secular. But it is also connected on multiple fronts to differences between Western Christendom and Orthodox Russian civilization. Putin has moved, in some ways very skillfully, to use a sort of partial revival of religion in the former Soviet Union to cement his hold on power. The Russian sort of movements towards the Near East and are connected to Russia's traditional vision of itself as a protector of fellow Christians against the Ottoman Turk originally. Putin's posture and rhetoric around ISIS is an extension of that kind of rhetoric and so on. And you know, in all of these cases, you can try and sort of abstract the religious element away, and you can say, well, Putin's just motivated by power in this sense, and you know, the young men of ISIS just want to rape and pillage and do terrible things, and the migrants going to Europe are in search of a better life, and the people who are not necessarily being welcoming to the migrants aren't themselves, you know, the most devout of Christians, and so on. And you know, all of that's true, but it's still also true that there is a bright religious thread running through all of these stories, and these stories would be very different absent the religious element. The fact of ISIS's presence in the Middle East is connected to chaos, violence, civil war, and so on. But the nature of ISIS is defined by a particular interpretation of Islam, right? I mean, you could imagine a different version of ISIS that was barbaric and had some other organizing theory or no theory at all, but the reality is, to understand what the specific things ISIS is doing, it helps to understand why they think they are restoring a imaginary, but in their minds, purified form of Islam, and so on. So that's, you know, that would just be the sort of foreign affairs headline version of the case for the point I was making. But then, yeah, beyond that, I think it's simply the case that if you step anywhere outside the richest, most developed parts of the world, you will find intense religious growth. Latin America, it's Pentecostal and evangelical. Africa, it's Islamic and Christian. China, it's Christian. South Asia, it's all kinds of things. So there's that, and then even in the West itself, even in the most secularized portions, even in Northern Europe, the sort of ghostly elements of religion are still there, and people are not fully, even the most secular people are very rarely fully secularized.